Well, good morning. Today we are continuing our series, Encounters with Jesus. And if we can have my presentation up, I will. It just takes a moment to load. The line's going across the screen. The gerbils are. Right, there we go. Right. So we're continuing our series, Encounters with Jesus, and we've just read this story from Mark chapter 9, 14 to 29. This story of Jesus' encounter with a desperate and worried father. We read that his son has been possessed by an evil spirit that throws him into convulsions. Sometimes it throws him into the fire or into water in an attempt to kill him. And the man and other people have come to Jesus because they've heard that Jesus is performing miracles. But they can't find Jesus because Jesus has taken Peter, James, and John on a trek up into the mountains, but that's a whole other story that we're not going to go into now. But the crowd have found the remaining disciples. And these disciples have obviously tried and failed to heal this man's son. Back in chapter 6, Jesus had sent his disciples out in pairs, and he sent them out with the instruction to go and preach and heal. And Mark specifically records that Jesus had given them authority over evil spirits. And they'd been out doing it. They'd been out healing people. They'd been out driving out demons. But something about this situation was a little bit different. They tried and they'd failed. And now Jesus has come down the mountain. The people have seen him and they're all running to greet him. Eventually, the boy is brought to Jesus, and as soon as the spirit sees Jesus, it throws the boy into another convulsion. And after a few more words, Jesus sends the spirit away and the boy is healed. But in the middle of this story, there is this conversation about belief and unbelief, about faith and doubt. When Jesus hears that the disciples have been unable to cure the boy, he says, "You unbelieving generation, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you?" And then a bit later in the story, the father says to Jesus, "But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." To which Jesus replies, "If you can, everything is possible for one who believes." And then the man replies with these words that we can probably all identify with. "I do believe, help me with overcome my unbelief." Now, I don't know about you, but for me, this particular story in the Gospels is one of those stories that throws up so many questions. And it opens up so many different rabbit holes that we could go down, that we could be here for an awfully long time. If you've read the bulletin this week, you'll see that there is no Monday at 8 tomorrow because it's half term. So, but if you do have questions, then please do email them to me, and we can pick them up at the next Monday at 8, which will be on the 20th. So don't keep those questions to yourselves. Feel free to email them through. And I think for a lot of people, their slide from belief to unbelief, or their slide from having an active faith to having no faith, or their slide from that point where they do pray to that point where they no longer pray, often starts with experiences of unanswered prayer. Jesus says everything is possible for one who believes. So how are we supposed to make sense of those situations where we've believed, where we've trusted, and yet nothing has happened? Some of you will know that Rebecca was very ill when she was born. She spent the first week of her life in a specialist unit at Great Ormond Street Hospital, and then she spent 2 weeks in the ICU at our local hospital in North London before she was able to come home. And in the first few days of her life, there was a real question over whether or not she would even survive. It was a very real prospect that she would die. Scans showed that she'd had a bleed on the brain, and the doctors weren't sure what the implications of that would be, even if she ever regained consciousness. And lots of people were praying for her, and lots of people... And lots of people were praying. I knew this would happen. It does every time I talk about it. And lots of people were praying for us. I remember having a conversation with the consultant, and I was trying to push him as to what were the implications of this going to be. And he told me, well, it's too early to tell, but that bleed on the brain isn't going anywhere. And there was something in that moment, some voice in my head that said, we'll see about that. The following week, I had another conversation with another consultant in a different hospital, and she was looking at the results of the scan, the latest scan that they'd just taken. She was looking at Rebecca's notes, and she said something along the lines of, well, I'm reading that Rebecca had a bleed on the brain, but I can't see any evidence of it on the scan. And so I believe that God performed a miracle. I believe that God answered prayer. Fast forward almost 2 years. Sophie is a day old, and we are in the Brompton Hospital because doctors have detected that there's something seriously wrong with her heart that's going to require open heart surgery. And so she had to have regular checkups and scans in those early weeks of her life because they couldn't do anything until she was big enough, but they didn't want to leave it too long in case additional damage was done to her heart. And every single one of those appointments that we went to where they were monitoring what was going on, I was convinced, 100% convinced, that we would hear exactly the same thing that we'd heard with Rebecca. I can see from her notes that there's something wrong with her heart, but on the scan, I can't see any evidence of it. And every time we went, I was convinced we'd hear that message, even up until the point at which she went for her operation at 11 weeks old. I believed that God would do a miracle, but he didn't. Did I have more faith the first time round? Was it because there were more people praying? Is that why God answered the prayers the first time round, but not the second time round? Now, I don't think that I had any particular faith or expectation that God was going to heal Rebecca. I remember sitting in the chapel at Great Ormond Street Hospital. She was just a couple of days old. I was there on my own. She was still unconscious. There was still no idea, they had no idea whether she would regain consciousness or not. And I was sat in the empty chapel, and it was one of those occasions in my life where I felt closest to God that I've ever felt. There was no reassurance from God that everything was going to be okay. I'd told God that I trusted him whatever happened, and I had this overwhelming reassurance from God that whatever happens, I will be with you. But there was no sense that it was going to turn out okay or not. Sue and I didn't really pray a lot in that first week, if by praying you mean putting a whole bunch of words together in a sentence. We sat around a lot, we waited a lot, we cried a lot, we waited for doctors to talk to us a lot, and we kept in touch with a few people. Now, this was in the day, even just 17, 18 years ago, this was the day where you had to go to an internet cafe if you wanted to email people. And those emails went to a few people who sent them to a few people who sent them to more people, and they went all over the world. And so whatever time of day or night it was, there was somebody praying somewhere on the planet for us. But in terms of believing that God would do something that was impossible, I was 100% certain the second time round with Sophie. I'd already seen what God could do, and I believed that he would do it again. And I was absolutely gutted when he didn't, when she had to go for surgery. But even as I tell those stories, I am very conscious that they are stories that ended well. Even without the miracle of a new heart, Sophie has received amazing care at the hands of incredibly gifted surgeons and doctors and nurses within the NHS. And yes, she's going to need another operation in a few years' time. But it's just routine day surgery. And I am aware that this would not be the outcome if we were a family who was living, say, somewhere like Afghanistan or Chad. And so, even though that is my experience, I am conscious as I talk about it that there are people who have prayed and their child didn't make it. Or that person who's been praying for healing from a long-term illness and they don't get better. Or that loved one who died of cancer. What about those that are caught up in the events in Turkey and Syria this week? Those who've lost multiple members of their families. Are we really supposed to believe that everything is possible for the one who believes? And if we are, how do we make sense of it when it doesn't happen? What is the point in praying if God is just going to do what he wants anyway? I am very conscious that this is a subject that we can't possibly do justice to in a few minutes, in a format where I'm stood here talking and you're sat there listening. It's really a topic that needs to be covered either one-to-one or within the context of a small group with a cup of coffee and a piece of cake, or out on a long walk with someone as part of a conversation. If you're the sort of person who likes reading as you wrestle with these sorts of questions, then I can highly recommend this book, God on Mute, by Pete Greig, in which he wrestles with some of these things. The guy... Sean, can you... I seem to have... Ah, there it is. Are you controlling it from the... Yeah, okay, I'll have to... I'll see whether we... I've seemed to have lost control. So, a guy who's seen God do incredible miracles, but also within his personal life and within it, with his wife, has experienced unanswered prayer. His wife has a very serious medical condition and still continues to suffer with it. So I'd highly recommend this book, God on Mute. So I recognise that we can't do this justice in this kind of format. So what I want to do over the next few minutes is just do my best to kind of lay out a few pointers that might act as way markers for those conversations that we might want to have at some point in the future, to kind of point us in a particular direction and we might want to steer that conversation in. Now, what happens if I press this button? Still nothing. Right, Sean, this is your moment. Great. So, I've already started with a little bit of my personal experience, and I think that is what I would do if I was talking with someone who was kind of wrestling with this sort of thing. And I would want to say that as I look back on my life, I can say that the times when I've experienced God most have been the most difficult times in my life. And Those are the times that have shaped my life the most. It has been the hardest times. And so, whilst I wouldn't want to go through those events again, and I wouldn't wish them on anyone else, I wouldn't be the person that I am if I hadn't gone through those times. And so I think for me personally, trying to make sense of all this, I can see how God has used those times and God has used those events to shape me into the person that he wants us to be. But I think it's important that we do move from personal experience and come to the Bible. As I've often said, it's important to remember that everything that we read in the Bible was written for somebody else. It wasn't written for me. And so as we hear Jesus say, everything is possible for one who believes, he is talking to a father who has just asked if you can do anything. Let's compare that comment with some of the encounters that we've looked at so far. If we can have the next slide, Sean. So the man with leprosy a few weeks ago, he said, Lord, if you are willing, can you make me clean? Not if you are able, but if you are willing. Next slide. So in Matthew's account of this same story, Jesus concludes by saying to his disciples, truly I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. Next slide. Now, there's no evidence in the Gospels that the disciples went on from this place and moved a literal mountain. I don't think there's any evidence that a literal mountain has ever moved and thrown itself into the sea. There's no evidence that the disciples ever tried to move a mountain, and I don't think the disciples would have taken Jesus literally at this point. What Jesus was doing was comparing the size of their faith, as a little mustard seed, with the things that that faith would be able to do. Because it's not the size of our faith that is important, it is where that faith is focused. It is focused in Jesus. So when we put our faith in Jesus, no matter how small that faith may be, it means that we acknowledge that we are coming to the one who is the creator of the universe. He just spoke and things just appeared. It means that I'm coming to the one who loved me so much that he was prepared to die on a cross for me so that I can know forgiveness, so that I can stand in his presence. And so on the one hand, we have the God who is the creator of everything, and on the other hand, he is a God who was prepared to die so that we might go free. Next slide, please. I might better. Now, as a parent, I don't always do what my children ask me to do. I don't always give them what they ask for. There are times when I make them do things they don't want to do on a daily basis. Not because I'm horrible, although I'm sure that they do think that at times, but because I love them, and as a parent, I know what is best for them. And now, obviously, if you push that analogy too far, it breaks down. But it does at least alert us to the fact that we should be wary if we're thinking that God is a God who will do everything that we want him to. You know, what kind of God would it be if he was shaped by what we wanted? What would the followers of such a God be like? It's always really important not to take verses out of context, but to look at what the whole of the Bible witness is. And so in the Old Testament, if you were to go somewhere like, I don't know, Lamentations, or Ezekiel, or Job, or Psalms, or Jeremiah, then you will find there faithful followers of God who are crying out to God in their struggle and in their pain and in their suffering, asking God questions like, how long am I going to have to wait until you do something? Coming into the New Testament, we read in Acts the experience of the early Christians. And yes, there were some amazing miracles, but there were also some terrible persecutions and suffering. Many of Jesus' disciples were ultimately killed for their faith. There's a potential that I might be back in control of the slides, Sean, but I'm going to apologize to you all if not, and even if I am, because I'm going to hit you with a whole bunch of verses. So I don't normally do this, but we're just going to kind of a whistle stop through various New Testament verses that we might want to reflect on as we consider this broader question. Don't forget that if you don't get them all down, you can watch it back on YouTube or on the church website, where you can pause and write stuff down and press play and carry on. So let's see, am I in control? Whoa, right. 2 Corinthians 12, 9 and 10. In this passage, we read about something that Paul refers to as his thorn in the flesh. And he asks God to take it away 3 times, but God doesn't. And instead, God replies, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. In Philippians chapter 4, 11 to 13, Paul says, I'm not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. Earlier on in chapter 2 and verse 27, he's been talking about a guy called Epaphroditus. And he says in this letter, indeed he was ill and almost died, but God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but also on me, to spare me sorrow upon sorrow. And as I read that within a context of a letter, it gives me the impression that clearly Paul had lost other close friends. He knew what it was to experience sorrow. And from this letter we get the sense that yes, Epaphroditus was spared, but Paul had experience of other people, other friends who they prayed for, who had fallen sick and went on to die. Let's get a little bit more challenging. James chapter 1, 2 to 4. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. And then just a few verses later in verse 12. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. Loving God and God loving us is not mutually exclusive from experiencing trials. Those two things often go hand in hand. I'm conscious that time is going, but I'm just going to throw a few more thoughts into the mix. Jesus' priority, if we come back to the Gospels, Jesus' priority was preaching the good news about the kingdom of God. And as we saw a few weeks ago with the story of the leper, there is a sense that Jesus almost sees the miracles as getting in the way. He's not there to heal, he's there to preach. And he doesn't want kind of his reputation as a healer to kind of swamp his ability to be able to go and to preach. And there were plenty of people that Jesus didn't heal. He moved on from one village, there were still people there who needed to come to him, but Jesus wanted to go elsewhere in order to preach. And so when it comes to our belief, I think it's important that we realize that there is something that is more important than physical healing. That's why we celebrate communion. That's why Jesus draws us back to this table again and again and again, because a much greater healing has gone on. In 1 John 5:13, John says, I write these things to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, so that you may know that you have eternal life. Matthew 10:28, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. And so, whatever it was that Jesus meant by his words in Mark chapter 9, it clearly wasn't that as a Christian, I can just pray and all my problems will go away. The Bible paints a much bigger picture. And the picture that the Bible paints is a picture that stretches beyond death. And so my hope is not based on a God who's going to heal me every time I am sick. My hope is in a God who loves me so much that he allowed the cross to happen so that I can know forgiveness, so that I can know peace, and so that I can look forward to a future with him. And in the meantime, I pray. And when I pray, I come to the one who I believe can do anything. The one for whom nothing is impossible. And so, of course, I will ask for the impossible. But I submit to his will because he is God and not me. And more than physical intervention, I ask for the strength to go on believing in spite of everything, to go on trusting in spite of everything, to go on rejoicing, so that at the end we might all remain faithful. Let's pray.